I don't want to say whining, but, like ranting against media consolidation or something like that. I don't find that just the most interesting approach. I'm not saying anyone here does. I just, I think, to me, other things turn me on about that kind of study. And so that is, I think it's instructive for everybody, grad students who are trying to stake out their own position on a topic, to resist whatever, there might be people who really want you to write a certain way, but if you don't feel that, if you don't feel compelled to do that, then don't, write what you feel compelled to write about. And I think the quality of your work will be so much better. If I were kind of put in a mold of being someone who rails against big media, I don't think my work would be as interesting. So that's one thing. And the other thing I find in doing contemporary media studies is the resistance of some to be able to read across media. So my book, for example, I had a reviewer say and granted I didn't give the whole book for the review, so it was just a chapter or two. They said this isn't a cable history. And I was feeling the whole time I was writing it that I should just retitle it as a history of cable, because I realized that this particular history was actually a history of cable more than anything. And it's interesting, the resistance to seeing film history as the same thing as cable history, as the same thing as broadcast history in a particular era. And so I just think that it's, that's one thing I've encountered, is that there are ways of reading texts and reading and practicing your field that don't necessarily always translate with the way that people who think about industries look at it. I can't see it any other way, but people who focus on the text can't see it the way I do. So I think that's another area that kind of comes up for me a lot.
Okay, Toby, what about you?
Yeah, sure. Well, in my case, I divided between journals and books. So I started a journal 10 years ago called Television and New Media, and I'm just about to stop being the editor finally at the end of 2010, but when it was due to start, it was going to be just about television, and it had gone through a big reviewing process / market testing of about 30-odd academics saying, would you publish in this, would you subscribe to it, would you recommend it to people, all this sort of thing. It goes on when journals are being considered for purchase by a publisher. And only one person had said, I would never publish in this because of that bastard Toby Miller. And everybody else had said, I've no idea who this guy is, but whatever, let's just say yes. Give us the $50 and we'll say it's all right. And then the managing director of the publishing house had a cocktail party on his yacht, moored off Los Angeles, and a woman there whom he was trying to hit on, who had just arrived from Amsterdam at the cocktail party, had been at a new media conference and said, oh, television's dead. So this was 1999. No one's going to be watching it anymore. So he skittled the project on the grounds that I represented the past, and the woman that he was so keen on spoke only of the future. So that's the first major critique I've encountered. The second one was I also edited social text during the Sokol affair. So at that time we were criticised for being sort of limp-wristed, limp-brained, knock-kneed cultural studies wankers who weren't properly rigorous and didn't know how to run a journal and so on. And I, in particular, I went through literally the equivalent of a tenure review by Duke University Press, conducted by the provost, where I was not on the faculty, but Duke University Press published the journal, and Duke University had overall legal responsibility for the press itself. So that wasn't very nice. And I'm now also co-editor of a journal called Social Identities with Paul Ahluwalia, and there we receive a lot of submissions from Israel, and if we don't publish them without criticism and without any editing, we're accused of being anti-Semitic on quite a routine basis. So that's my journal experience. On the book front and book chapter front, I get accused of ranting very often by editors, not the editors within publishing houses, but academics who are editing books. And they say, when we invited you to write this, we thought you'd be rigorous and interesting, but instead you're just hectoring and lecturing and being like Bill Clinton with his finger. Please don't. And then I say, if you didn't know who and what I was, why did you ask me to write something? Go away. And then we have some kind of rapprochement whereby I continue to rant, but I add some more footnotes. That outweighs the ranting. In terms of the political economy elements of what I do, they are often dismissed as being pessimistic. This is a word that gets used. And at the moment, there's a very interesting brewing debate, which may or may not become public, and I'm not even certain that I really want to participate, because I tend to subscribe to the never complain, never explain crew. I don't reply to reviews. I mean, I'm doing this because you asked me, but in general, I don't make a fuss about these sorts of things being said to and about me. But at the moment, there's a thing brewing, because in the discussion about the nature of creative industries and how to understand them, some of which goes on very interestingly in Jennifer's last book, which she edited with Professor Perrin. There are people saying that on the left, within the debate about how to understand culture industries, cultural economy, creative industries, there is a tendency to essentialize the ideas of neoliberalism and essentialize the ideas of neoclassical economics and endow them with a massive authority and power in everyday life, in governmental policy, in the operation of capital, and in, if you like, the subjectivities of the rational calculating subject, whereas it is claimed by those who are supportive of the idea of creative industries, who are the Richard Florida types, that in fact, if you look at people like, names that people will be familiar with, Amartya Sen, Joe Stieglitz, Paul Krugman, these are not absolute neoclassical figures. You know, Krugman has this theory about trade, that it's never equal. Stieglitz has this theory about information, that you can never really have perfect information before making choices. And Sen has this theory about, well, lots of things, but for example, questions of capacities and how they are given out to people that are going to be marked by gender and other social identity factors. So there's this brewing debate where on the one hand, people like me and a few others, like Dave Hesmondhalgh and Kate Oakley and Justin O'Connor, are deemed to be misleading the world, however tiny our world is, by suggesting that there's political economy, which is the great truth of labour and what it does, and there's environmentalism and so on, the great truth of what it does, and versus this ridiculous, supposedly reductive yet dominant neoliberal model of the calculating consumer, and that in fact this leaves out the fact that there are many heterodoxies within economics that get rewarded because people like Stieglitz and Krugman get Nobel Prizes.
Okay, well that is a good way to go into the next question is, what do you think are the burning issues in studying media industries, or what are a few?
Okay, I wrote a couple of notes. We had homework, so I did some homework. I'm sure we're going to touch on a lot of the same ones. I think one of the issues is, what is an industry? What exactly do we mean by that term? You know, and I've spent quite a lot of time studying the moment when the Indian film sort of practitioners the Indian film trade was granted industry status in India in 1998, because I wanted to look at that moment when what we take to be self-evident actually gets constituted in certain forms of practice. So I think that that's one of the very interesting questions today, is how do we define an industry? Where do we draw boundaries? I think convergence is one of the ways in which to think about this, but I think sometimes convergence asks the right questions but comes up with the wrong answers, or maybe sometimes the other way around. I think it's in some ways a kind of conceptual way to think about this problem of what is an industry. So I think I would say that even if we take and we think about piracy. Well, is piracy an industry? Classically we would say no, because of levels of inputs, outputs, etc. It doesn't necessarily classically conform, but I think we would all understand that in terms of modes of distribution, etc., it maps onto a lot of industrial practices. So I think that piracy is a really interesting example, and I've done a bit of work on that. Even if we take the marginally agreed upon definition of an industry, I think we have to understand that that's in crisis. And I think there's two ways to think about this. One is a crisis of enumeration, and that's really a question of how do you count, right? And what do you count, right? So it's a data problem. The associated problem, I think, is the problem of models. What do you do with the numbers once you get them? And I think in some ways this dilemma, and you can think about all the ways in which this shows up. I'm obsessed with the Winter Olympics these days, so I could give you lots of curling analogies, but I won't do that. But I think that if we think about this question of data, this question of enumeration, and this question of model building, I think these are some of the things that the industry is really sort of questioning and working through. And you can think about IP as a way to enter into that. You can think about piracy as a way to enter into that, and also this increasingly permeable distinction between formality and informality, especially in terms of South Asia, where I've done a lot of my more recent work. There's this kind of functional understanding of how informality works. In the West we think of piracy as this kind of spectacular form, right? But it's the everyday in 99% of the world. So there's this seepage and leakage between formality and informality that is actually constitutive of industrial practice in most of the world. And I think that we have both, Hollywood especially trying to figure that out, but also I think academically, trying to figure that out as well. And I've been trying to work on some of those things.
Who wants to go next?
Well, in studying industries, I think a question everybody should ask themselves, if that's what you want to do, is do I want to also study economics? Am I interested in accounting? Am I interested in policy? Am I interested in understanding law or legal history? Because that is all going to come up when you're trying to understand various questions and crises. And if those are not, maybe on the surface they don't sound very interesting, but once you start doing some of this type of research, it's completely fascinating. But I was just speaking to a very high-profile attorney the other day who said to me, if you don't understand the difference between the intersection of finance and accounting, you have no idea what you're even talking about when you're talking about media industries. And I was thinking, I didn't even know there was a difference between finance and accounting. And he's talking about this specialized intersection. And when he explained it all, it was all about the way that various costs were amortized and when and how that actually dictated release patterns. And so these are things you have to be willing to, I think, plunge into.